Have you ever wondered why two highly educated people can look at the exact same pile of data, study the exact same numbers, and somehow walk away with two completely opposite realities?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we see it happen literally every day in, economics, medicine, definitely in the news.
Definitely the news. And today, we're doing a deep dive into a highly unusual source text that, well, it kind of serves as a master key for understanding why that actually happens.
It really does.
It acts as this blueprint for how human logic is built, and honestly, how it can be so easily manipulated.
Yeah, and the source material itself is so fascinating because it's an excerpt simply titled text, and it is remarkably stark.
It's just a list, right?
Exactly. It consists of exactly 50 words. There are no definitions provided. There's no surrounding context at all. It is literally just a curated list of terms.
Right. And if you were to just, glance at it quickly, it looks like a study guide for some graduate level standardized test.
Yeah, just flashcards.
Yeah. Just 50 isolated vocabulary words floating in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
But that is the illusion we're going to completely shatter in this deep dive.
Because when you actually start to map the relationships between these 50 words, you realize they aren't random at all.
Not at all.
They are the structural components of every argument, every scientific discovery, and, well, really every major intellectual pursuit in human history.
So we are going to outline the step-by-step roadmap that these specific words represent. It's basically the entire life cycle of an idea.
Right. The text lays out the exact mechanics of how we take a raw, kind of fuzzy thought, build a structure around it, test it against the friction of reality, and then, distribute it out to the world.
And the goal for you, the listener, isn't just for us to read you a dictionary. You already know what these words mean. We want to uncover the hidden architecture beneath them.
The friction between them?
Exactly. So let's jump right into the first phase of this life cycle. The spark and the structure. Because every great pursuit, whether it's, mapping the human genome or developing a new financial model, it has to start somewhere messy.
Always.
And the text captures this genesis beautifully with words like conceive and notion.
Yeah, the word notion is incredibly fragile. I mean, it is essentially a whisper of a possibility,
Yeah,
but the text shows us the mechanical progression required to harden it. If you feed and interrogate that notion, it eventually elevates into a testable hypothesis.
but to actually test a hypothesis, you need boundaries.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't test a boundless, chaotic idea.
No, you'd be testing forever.
Exactly. And that is where our next cluster of words comes in. To keep our early, preliminary thoughts from spinning out into absolute chaos, we have to rely on a framework, a paradigm, and a parameter.
And the text also gives us principle and clause in this section.
Right. Those function as the intellectual guardrails for the entire project.
Yeah.
I like to compare it to building a house, actually.
Oh, okay.
Like, to conceive a notion is basically drawing those back-of-the-napkin sketches. But the framework and parameters, those are the actual blueprints and the property lines.
That's a great way to put it. Because without a framework that's grounded in core principles, your hypothesis just bleeds into everything else.
Right.
The parameters define the exact scope of what you are actually testing, and a clause dictates the specific rules of engagement for that test.
But let's explore the friction here for a second. Because in these early preliminary stages, the text gives us two very different verbs for how we approach the unknown.
Right, pose versus presume.
Yeah. We can choose to pose a question, or we can choose to presume an answer. Structurally speaking, what happens to our framework if we choose to presume?
Well, that is precisely where the architecture of an idea begins to fail.
Wow.
Because when you pose a question, the parameters of your framework are set by the unknown variables you're actively trying to measure. You let the natural data dictate the shape of the room.
Oh, yeah.
But when you presume, you have already built the room, and you are literally forcing the data to fit inside it. You are smuggling your own conclusion into the foundation before the work has even begun.
It contaminates the model.
Yeah.
Let's say you are building an economic model, and you presume that a market is going to crash specifically because of inflation.
Right.
Your parameters might then be set to completely exclude or ignore data showing, say, robust consumer spending or high employment,
Right.
just because it doesn't fit the presumption.
Exactly. You blind yourself structurally. And that happens constantly in high-level research. If your paradigm is flawed, your parameters will filter out the truth.
Right.
Think about early astronomical models. If you presume the Earth is the center of the universe, you have to invent incredibly complex, convoluted math to explain why the planet seemed to move backward in the sky.
Oh, the epicycles.
Yes, the presumption forces the framework to become completely distorted.
So we have drawn up the blueprints and set the parameters, ideally by posing questions rather than, making presumptions. But you can't live in a blueprint forever.
You really can't.
Eventually, you have to break ground and find your materials.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the next massive phase outlined in the text, which is gathering the evidence required to build our case.
Yeah, and this introduces a cluster of highly investigative verbs. We get compile, extract, inspect, trace, and identify.
Notice the sheer physical effort implied there.
Yeah, we don't just passively receive data from the universe. We choose to compile it. We actively extract it from the overwhelming noise of the world.
It feels incredibly tactile, doesn't it? Words like extract and trace. It's like a detective physically pulling clues from a crime scene.
It is very hands-on.
And the text gives us two primary lenses for that extraction, empirical and qualitative. Now, since you guys listening know the basic difference, empirical being the hard, measurable numbers, qualitative being the descriptive, contextual human elements, let's talk about the tension between them.
Because we see entire fields of study derail when they over-index on one and completely ignore the other.
Yes, it is a massive vulnerability in modern analysis.
Oh, absolutely. Take healthcare data as a prime example. If a hospital administration only looks at the empirical data, say a spreadsheet showing that the average patient visit time has decreased by 20%, they might claim the hospital is becoming highly efficient.
Right, the numbers look great.
But if they completely ignore the qualitative reality that doctors are severely burned out, patients feel totally rushed, and misdiagnoses are actually up because of that speedwell, their model is entirely disconnected from reality.
Right.
You absolutely need the qualitative context to tell you what the empirical data actually means.
That leads perfectly into this next major tension in the text, which is the relationship between an instance and a phenomenon. As you are actively compiling all this evidence, how do you logically decide when a single isolated instance graduates into a full-blown phenomenon that requires deep inspection?
That's the million-dollar question. It really comes down to pattern recognition, reproducibility, and honestly, a bit of statistical courage.
Courage. How so?
Well, a single data point that defies your model is just an instance. It is an anomaly. If you overhaul your entire framework every time you see a single instance, your system just collapses into noise.
Right, like the early days of a viral outbreak. One patient showing up with a highly unusual immune response is an instance. It's a curiosity, but you don't lock down an entire city over it.
Yes, exactly. But the danger there is institutional inertia. Often systems are programmed to just ignore anomalies.
Oh, right.
Look at the discovery of the hole in the ozone layer.
Okay.
Satellites had been extracting data for years showing massive drops in ozone, but the software parameters were set to flag those extreme low numbers as sensor errors.
Wait, really? They just threw the data out?
Yes, they treated them as flawed instances. It wasn't until scientists actively chose to inspect the raw data and trace the anomaly over time that they realized the pattern held. That is when the instance crossed the threshold into a catastrophic phenomenon.
That is wild. So it is an incredibly tightrope walk. You have to be disciplined enough not to mistake a random instance for a global phenomenon, but awake enough not to ignore that single instance that might be the key to shifting the entire paradigm.
Right, and managing that tension requires robust logic, which brings us to the next crucial transition in our text.
The bottleneck. We have compiled our empirical evidence, identified the phenomena, and we are sitting on a mountain of data. But raw data without logic is essentially useless.
It's just noise.
Exactly. A box full of evidence isn't a conviction. We must transition from gathering the data to processing the data.
And the source text shifts heavily here into the mechanics of meaning-making. We see words like assess, derive, interpret, interpretation, and ultimately insight.
Cognitive heavy lifting.
Exactly. You have to assess the weight and validity of your extracted evidence, and then you use formal logic to derive conclusions from it.
I want to stop and unpack two specific words here that are constantly misused, even in high-level research. And they're both explicitly listed in our source text. Deduce versus infer.
Oh, people get those mixed up all the time.
Right. People use them interchangeably to basically mean guessing, but they represent two totally different logical engines in this factory. Let me throw an analogy at you to see if it tracks with the structural difference.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Let's say the empirical data we've gathered is a massive pile of baking ingredients sitting on a counter.
Okay.
If I am deducing, I am looking at a strict established recipe. If I have flour, sugar, baking soda, and I follow the chemical formula perfectly, I Deduce, that I am absolutely guaranteed to get a cake, it's top-down.
Right.
But inferring is bottom-up. Inferring is being blindfolded, taking a bite of a mystery dish, tasting cinnamon and apples, and guessing, okay, based on these recognizable elements, I infer this is an apple pie.
That is spot on. That bottom-up pattern recognition is the absolute hallmark of inductive logic. When you deduce, the conclusion is structurally guaranteed by the premises.
Like math.
Exactly. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. It is airtight, but it rarely generates entirely new knowledge. It just reveals what was already mathematically true.
Interesting.
But when you infer, you are dealing in probabilities. You are looking at the observable empirical evidence and making the most logically sound leap possible to explain the unknown.
And you need both engines running simultaneously to form an accurate interpretation.
You do. Because the ultimate goal of all this assessing and deriving isn't just to categorize facts into folders. We do all of this heavy lifting to achieve one specific thing, which is an insight.
The aha moment. Because an insight is fundamentally different from a fact. A fact is knowing that a specific door in a building is locked. An insight is understanding why the architect put a lock on that door in the first place.
Yes, an insight requires synthesizing the raw data with human context to create a completely new understanding. But, once you have achieved that insight, you face a totally different set of structural challenges.
Yes, the transition into communication. Because having a brilliant insight while sitting alone in a dark room doesn't move the needle for humanity at all.
No, it doesn't.
If you want that idea to survive, if you want it to actually matter, you have to navigate the incredibly tricky process of transmitting it to other people without losing the nuance you just worked so hard to derive.
And the text provides a highly precise vocabulary for this transition. The core tension in this subset of words is profound. We are dealing with the battle between what is implicit and what is explicit.
Right.
We have words like imply, denote, specify, precise, coherent, adequate, analogy, and illustrate.
I like to think of this transition using the concept of digital data compression.
Oh, that's a good one.
When you have a massive complex idea in your head, all the nuance and context is implicit to you because you've lived with the data for years. But when you have to compress that file to send it to someone else's brain, if you aren't perfectly explicit about certain parameters, that file unzips on their end as a garbled mess.
Yeah.
It's no longer coherent.
That is a highly accurate way to look at it. But I would actually argue that in the realm of human communication, there is a deep strategic layer to this.
What do you mean?
Well, we tend to assume that being purely explicit, where you meticulously specify and denote every single detail, is always the superior choice. But it really isn't.
Wait, really? I would assume in a quest for a coherent transfer of complex ideas, being purely explicit is the only safe path.
It is absolutely necessary when giving technical instructions. I mean, if you are training a surgeon or programming a flight computer, you must be entirely explicit.
Of course.
But if you want to persuade a populace or change a deeply held belief, being overly explicit can actually backfire. If I spell out every single conclusion for you, it can feel patronizing. It puts people on the defensive because it doesn't engage their own critical thinking.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. And that perfectly explains why words like analogy and illustrate are included in this section of the text.
Exactly. When you use an analogy, you are purposefully leaving the final connection implicit. You provide the structure, but you invite the audience's brain to bridge the gap and derive the insight themselves.
Because if I derive the insight myself, my brain registers it as my own idea.
Yes.
I own it. I'm not being lectured to. I'm participating in the logic.
I actually struggle with this myself in my own writing. It's a constant tightrope walk. To be adequate in communication doesn't just mean being loud and exhaustive. In this context, being adequate means providing exactly enough explicit structure for the other person to safely navigate the implicit depths of the idea.
So what does this all mean for the final stage of our journey? We've structured the vague notion, we've gathered the empirical evidence while avoiding the trap of presumption, we've run the logic engines of deduction and inference to get our insight, and we've carefully calibrated our analogies to communicate it clearly.
It means we are finally ready to move from the abstract realm into concrete action and public record. We are bringing it to the world.
Yes.
And looking at the final cluster of words, the text reveals that ideas must be refined before they can actually generate real-world value.
This final grouping feels like a massive fork in the road to me. On one hand, we have words pointing toward immediate action. You become a practitioner.
Right.
You take the insight and you implement it in the real world to generate a result. This is the doctor applying the new treatment, or the engineer actually building the bridge based on the new physics paradigm.
And then on the other side of that fork, we have the academic and institutional sharing of knowledge. You formalize your findings into a thesis, you write an abstract, you meticulously cite and quote prior work, and it all culminates in a formal lecture or a publication.
Well, let's slow down and look at two specific mechanics here that I think people take for granted. The abstract and the citation.
Oh, definitely.
In today's high-velocity information economy, an abstract isn't just a polite summary. It is a brutal gatekeeper. If your abstract isn't incredibly precise, no one is reading the rest of the publication. It is the ultimate test of whether you can compress your insight adequately.
And the citation is just as critical. Choosing to cite someone isn't just, formatting etiquette.
Right, it's not just to avoid plagiarism.
No. Citations are the structural rebar connecting your new knowledge to the established concrete of human history. They prove you didn't just invent your framework in a vacuum. A robust trail of citations shows exactly how you trace the phenomenon through the empirical data of those who came before you.
Which all leads to the final, heaviest word in the entire process. Conclude. It feels so definitive. You step up to the podium for your lecture, or you release your publication, and you conclude the work.
Yeah.
But I have to push back on the finality of that word. Does a publication actually close the loop? Because from where I'm sitting, a publication essentially just resets the board.
I completely agree. And honestly, that is the most beautiful secret hidden within this list of 50 words. Knowledge is not a straight line. It is an upward spiral.
Oh, I love that.
Your formal publication, your finalized thesis, simply becomes the raw empirical data for tomorrow's practitioner.
Right. You publish your conclusion, and you are literally handing the next generation of thinkers the exact material they need to conceive their own new notions.
Exactly.
They will inspect your work, they will extract your data, they will inevitably find new anomalies, and they will use them to formulate a completely new paradigm.
Yeah.
The end of the list is just the fuel for the beginning of the list.
It is the perpetual engine of human progress.
Let's pull all of this together for the listener. We started with what looked like a mundane, random list of 50 vocabulary words from a source simply called text.
Yeah, just flashcards.
Exactly. But by simply uncovering the architecture beneath them, we've revealed a complete, elegant roadmap of critical thinking. From the very second a fragile notion is conceived, through the rigorous setting of parameters and the extraction of empirical data, through the heavy logic of deducing and inferring to reach an insight, all the way to the day we step up to a podium to publish a conclusion.
And the real takeaway here is that mastering these concepts is not just an exercise for academics writing papers.
Not at all. Having this specific vocabulary and, more importantly, understanding the friction between these words, it basically gives you an analytical superpower.
It really does.
It gives you the ability to break down, reverse engineer, and truly understand any complex information you encounter. Whether you are reading a dense investigative report, evaluating a new business pitch, or just trying to navigate conflicting news stories, you now have the master key.
Yeah, you can actively ask, are they establishing a parameter or just making a presumption?
Right.
Are they over-indexing on empirical data while completely ignoring the qualitative reality? Are they logically deducing from facts or just aggressively inferring from a feeling?
When you possess the structural language of analysis, you can no longer be easily manipulated by faulty logic, smuggled assumptions, or incomplete data. You can see the blueprints, which means you can see exactly where the house is going to collapse.
Absolutely.
So we want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to mull over. We've just spent this entire deep dive mapping out the rigorous life cycle of creating and sharing knowledge, built entirely on a foundation of evidence, parameters, and logic. But what happens when the foundational parameters and paradigms we use to interpret the world shift fundamentally beneath our feet?
Oh, wow.
Think about it. If our core framework changes overnight, like the historical transition from believing the Earth was the center of the universe to realizing we orbit the sun, or the leap from classical physics to quantum mechanics, does all our meticulously gathered empirical data suddenly point to an entirely different truth?
That's a massive question.
Remember that perfectly structured house we talked about building? What happens when you realize halfway through construction that, based on a new paradigm, you were actually supposed to be building a submarine? Does the old evidence still matter, or do you have to conceive an entirely new notion from scratch? Think about that as you consume your next piece of data. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning the framework.